Our final session is Chairpersons biting more than they could chew. The activist role of chairpersons in some boards is cramping the operational efficiency of management. Are non-executive chairpersons getting into areas that legitimately belong to the realm of management? How can and where should the line be drawn? Our panelist for the session is Mr. Homi Khusrokhan, who has worked for 29 years with Glaxo and Burroughs Wellcome in India and retired as managing director of both the companies in the year 2000. During his stewardship in 1999, Glaxo was rated as India's most respected company across all industries by Business World. Later, he joined the Tata Group as the managing director of Tata Tea and also became the managing director of Tata Chemicals. In 2009, he was appointed a special advisor to the government-appointed board of Satyam Computer Services. He is presently chairman of the Indian Red Cross Society and of the Western region of the Employers Federation of India. He is also a senior advisor, private equity to Tata Capital. Next on the panel, we have Nawshir Mirza, who was a senior partner with SR Batliboi and Company, where he served in various leadership roles in audit and assurance domains. He was deputy chairman of British Business Group, the chair being traditionally occupied by a British national. He was also the country head of Jardine Matheson for 10 years. Currently, he is an independent director on several reputed boards. He is deeply involved in the movement for improved governance in companies and in improved accounting practices. He is also associated with several philanthropic initiatives such as the Indian Red Cross. Mr. Nawshir Mirza. And one of the panelists is also Mr. Damodaran, who's also the moderator for this session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yes, sir. Okay, great. We will make this a conversation. We will not resort to speech making. Nawshir agrees with me, and I am sure.
Yes, sure. Yes.
Homi also agrees with me. Right. So the question before us is very simple. Are chairpersons biting off more than they can chew? How much should they be biting is, of course, a relevant question to ask. And this is in the context of some chairpersons not being able to recognize that as chairs of the board, they are not chairs of the company. They have no role ordinarily, unless they are executive chairpersons, in the operations of the company. Their job is to look at it from above and perform the functions, help the board, lead the board to perform the functions of superintendence, direction and control. That's the job of the board, and facilitating that is the job of the chairman as the leader of the board. And yet, in recent times, we've seen instances where there is a tendency on the part of hyperactive chairpersons to step on the toes of management, to make life difficult for the CEO, to interfere in minor operational details because of one, absence of role clarity, the other having got to that position and not being told what the role of the chairperson is, to exercise functions that don't legitimately belong to a person heading the chair. That's the context in which we pose this question, and I have two very experienced fellow panelists with me here, so my job is easy. I will ask the questions to which I have no answers, to which I think they will come up with the answers, right? Okay. So first question, simply put, repeating the topic, are they biting off more than they can chew? Nawshir.
I wouldn't generalize. Sure, there will be chairpersons who are biting off more than they ought to bite off. And in particular, I think, Damodaran, we need to make a distinction between family-owned companies and non-family-owned companies. In family-owned companies, often a member of the family chairs the board. Or even if they don't chair the board, they are directors and they make someone like me the chair. But essentially, the chair of the board is sitting to my right in that board. And members of families who control companies inevitably are more involved than a real director, than purely a director ought to be, for obvious reasons, because they've got their financial stake in the company. And then there are chairs of boards or of committees who get themselves more involved than perhaps they ought to be. I myself have been guilty sometimes of that kind of conduct as, not the chair of a board, but maybe of the risk management committee or even the audit committee, sometimes of getting more involved than I ought to have. So I wouldn't generalize. There are many chairmen who behave very correctly, but there are also those who do not.
Homi, your initial
I
thoughts.
tend to agree with Nawshir that there is a large variation in the type of chairman you've come across. I have worked with several of them. Some can be very autocratic and say, this is what I want to do, and that has to be done. And some will be more democratic, they'll meet. I always feel everything shouldn't be done in the boardroom. Chairmen should also go out of the boardroom, they should talk to directors individually, they should meet them socially. I think a lot more can be done by boards if they're met outside the boardroom. In the confines of a boardroom, sitting with a fixed agenda, fixed time, it limits your ability to contribute. So quite often a meeting outside the board environment is far more productive than just have something discussed in a boardroom. But yes, I think some people tend to be very autocratic, some people tend to be very democratic, and some people say, look, this is what I feel, but you do what you want. So you've got three types of people I've worked with.
Well, just to strike a personal note, I was inducted on the board of a large company several years ago. I have stepped down from that board. The CFO was making a presentation, one of India's best CFOs, among the ones that I have seen. He had a 20 or 22 page slide presentation, and he had reached up to slide 3 when the chairman of the board said, I think I can explain this better. The CFO never got back into the conversation. It was a 1-hour conversation thereafter. He didn't get to slide number 4. So when that happened, I was a relative newcomer to the board, and I said, why don't we follow a practice of allowing the presentations to be completed, and we'll hold our questions till the end. So the chairman of the NRC, the former distinguished civil servant, who had actually selected me for that, at lunchtime told me that, you know what you've done? It amounts to, at some level, sacrilege. You have reduced the chairperson's air time from 98% to 96%, by preventing him from doing this. Now, the point is, if you have that kind of great chairman, lots of knowledge, definitely knew more than everybody else in the boardroom put together, but then the collective responsibility of the board got impacted by the fact that one man knew so much and was keen to share that. In fact, he did tell me that, you know what you've just done, you have prevented me from educating the board on matters that they should know. I said, it's only deferred education. Once the presentation is over, we'll have the benefit of your education. But he didn't buy that argument. He thought concurrent education was necessary. At the same time, I have been on a board where a promoter chairman, to your point, had to be persuaded by the rest of the board by asking him, Mr. Chairman, what is your view on the subject? Until then, he would keep his wisdom to himself. So there are various types. My worry really is that when you have chairpersons doing the MD's job, the CEO's job, the CFO's job, and everybody else's job, which they're not tasked to do, what then becomes of the company? Is this hyperactive chairman a problem? It's certainly not a solution. That's my issue.
I've had a very similar experience. I worked for a chairman who was absolutely allergic to PowerPoint presentations. So once some poor manager came in, after slide 3, he said, "Thank you very much, you can leave now."
Before he started.
Slide 3, and that was it. He didn't want to see anything more. And but his views were known. He said, "I don't like PowerPoint presentations because you only present the things you want me to see. I want to question you, I want to ask you." So his rule was, anything you want to put on the board, 2-page note. Not more than 2 pages, because your focus of attention goes down after that. 2-page note, no PowerPoints. That was his rule.
No, this is a chairman after my heart,
Yeah.
because I have always maintained, and I say this in public, power corrupts and PowerPoints corrupt absolutely.
Yeah,
But you know what you're saying about PowerPoint? I was
Yeah.
just 2 days ago with the board of an ARC, and they had an inspection by the Reserve Bank a month before or so. And the inspectors, in fact, mentioned in their report that whatever important issues presented by PowerPoint, why not in Word? The argument being PowerPoint is far too cryptic. Was all the necessary information actually communicated to the board of directors by management choosing this? But coming back to this extreme chairman that Damodaran you had, who took 98 and 96% and that sort of thing. But I think one of the most important jobs of a chairman of a board is to just improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the board. And to do that, he may often need to explain a more complicated issue that is being brought to the board, which perhaps the CFO in your example or whoever else is presenting has not explained it in the way the chairman perceives the board has understood it. Because there are many times technical issues, technical people presenting a technical issue don't often do it well enough for a generalist to understand. Because they are technical people, they assume the generalists have understood. So at that point, certainly the chairman should point out what are the key issues that are on the table and which the board needs to discuss. Because they may often be confused with a mountain of points that the presentation includes. And they have lost the wood for the trees. And the chairman has to again identify, this is the wood which we have to address. Don't be distracted by all the trees that were shown to you in PowerPoint or Word or orally.
Does this problem of hyperactive chairpersons derive from lack of role clarity, or is it an expression of personality in the boardroom?
I think it's an expression of personality because a person is built that way. The person I'm talking about wrote a book which was called To Challenge and to Change. Yeah. So he wasn't really going to sort of accept views of people without challenging them. Yeah. He was that sort of man, and clearly, had his own view on things, and a very strong view. And he was prepared to say, I want it done this way. So he didn't feel at all guilty about, dominating the board and making people do what he wanted to do. But he was effective, very effective at that.
But do these chairs, Nawshir, do they understand that they are first among equals and not sitting at the top?
If you ask them that question, yes, they would say, I understand that. But their behavior is contrary to what they believe they understand. Perhaps they don't. So, and I agree with Homi, it's a manifestation of their own behavior or their own personality more than not being clear about what their role is. Because if you become a chairman of a board, you should by then have understood that you are first among equals, as you rightly put it, and that your job is only to get your equals to deliver best. It's not beyond that.
Is this because...
One of the things which comes through when you're dealing with a very autocratic person like that is a good chairman will speak last. Because nobody speaks, everybody has to sort of either agree with him or politely disagree, but a good leader should speak last. He should draw out people, get others to talk, and come to the point of his own view right at the end. So he's got a full discussion going on. But if a person starts by saying, this is what I feel, then it's very difficult sometimes for people to even challenge what he's saying. The chairman has said that, I have to do what the chairman says. So I think one of the signals I look for is, does the guy speak first or he speaks last?
Yes, that's a very good point, yeah.
This is a good point, because you have some who want to play opening batsman, play middle order and play at the end.
Yeah.
Then there are some who have to be persuaded to actually pick up the bat in the boardroom. I mean, you have both these varieties. But the related point is, when people are appointed to chair a board, they don't have the benefit of any training on how to chair a board. It's assumed that when a person is appointed as a chair, he or she believes, I'll hit the ground running, I don't need anyone to tell me how I need to lead this board, so you don't understand what you need to do. You might have been a great executive, but here the requirements are different. You've got to step back a bit, look at things through the lens of wisdom, not the lens of knowledge. Now, is there a case for, and I want to get into some of what was discussed last time, Nawshir and I were talking about it in the last panel. Is there a case for mentoring the chairman, training the chairman in order how to be a chairman, and maybe a robust evaluation process when you determine whether that chairman is doing well, and to extend that further, getting into the previous panel's area, how can a robust evaluation process decide who needs to be compensated, how much? Because Nawshir, you have experience of this.
Yeah, I'll cover that. But this mentoring or training, I mean, we have in this room a whole lot of very eminent independent directors sitting somewhat in the front rows. The company secretaries are all at the back for whatever reason. How many of them are prepared to attend a 3-day independent director training course? How many have attended in the last 2-3 years? You will find, my experience, I do a lot of independent
Depends
director
on
training.
who conducts the training program.
Yeah,
That's
but
important.
I do a lot of it. Very few turn up for these things. It's all the budding independent
I will
directors.
see your name and say, no, I might
No.
go, not be speaking.
But so to expect the guy who thinks he's even superior to those, the chairman himself, to concede that he needs some amount of training or mentoring, would be expecting an unrealistic kind of response. But I agree with you that there is a certain amount of hand-holding, and I have had chairpersons, and I'll name one, which was the last board I sat on of Thermax, Mayor Padamji. Mayor is so conscious of, is she a good chair? So she has on the board eminent people. She's constantly asking them, am I doing it right? Am I doing something wrong? So on. And she's very receptive to guidance. So there are individuals like that. It's a family. She and her mother between them own more than 2/3 of the company. So they're very receptive. But there are, of course, by all our and your experiences, chairman, who are not. But coming to the hint you gave me, and this goes to our previous session about compensation. And for 10 years, I chaired the NRC of a major Tata company. Mr. Tata used to be a member of my NRC, and between him and me at that time, which is a long time ago, we developed actually an SOP, which I don't know if there's anyone here in the group, from the Tata group who is present, and if it's still practiced. The SOP, Damodaran, was that after the NRC had agreed as to what is the pot of commission that will be distributed this year, there was a process to that also, but I'll skip that. 40% of that pot was given on the basis of just attendance at board and committee meetings. I may be making a few errors here because it's many years ago now. 40% was given on the basis of that. The argument being, even if you didn't attend a single meeting, you still carried the risk, the point Sunil was making, that if something had gone wrong, you may not have attended, but you may still receive a notice from the regulator or the authorities and be in difficulty dealing with that. 40% was given on the basis of contribution during meetings. And who decided that? That was based on a proper feedback from directors of their peers, the director evaluation, and a conversation within the NRC to identify. And what we used to do is we used to have a rating of 1, 2, and 3. There were people who made very little contribution, they got a weightage of 1. Those who made extraordinary contribution during meetings got 3. And the last 20% was for contributions outside of meetings. Now the question was, how would the NRC know what an individual director had done outside? Because they were not there themselves to witness that, that contribution. So that was collected from all the management people who attended meetings. So as the chair, I would speak to the MD, any executive director, the CFO, almost inevitably sit through meetings, take their inputs, and we would allocate. So it's not true, and this has been, I mean, we first practiced this about 15 years ago. So there have been companies, and in the Tata Group certainly I can say, is where people are being compensated for contribution and performance. It's not that they all are lockstep, and your question was, and it was a valid question, every ID gets the same compensation, or every NED gets the same compensation. That wasn't the case. And I'll just tell you an amusing anecdote, amusing thing. You know, sometimes people say, if you don't compensate, people don't contribute. Now, we had a nominee on the board of a major financial institution. He was obliged to give his whole commission to the institution. He couldn't take it himself. As a result, he never spoke in the meetings.
Okay.
I don't know whether there was a connection, but he never spoke. I know he was there for 5 years, and I'm not exaggerating. In 5 years, God knows what, about 30, 40 meetings he attended, he never uttered a single word. So,
Almost sounds like some of our Rajya Sabha members who were
maybe,
nominated.
yes, you're right.
Eh?
But I think the kind of director, it's very rare to find somebody like that. Most chairmen would have a certain ego. I don't think they'd actually volunteer for training or being coached by somebody else. I mean, they feel they've done it before and they will carry on doing it. But I doubt very much whether a chairman
The very
would
fact they
put himself...
put as chairman, they think they're above everyone else anyway.
They've arrived. The
right.
point is that is the beginning of the problem.
Yeah,
When you have not chaired a board earlier, don't know the roles, but you think that you have arrived. So getting back to the evaluation process, do companies actually evaluate the role of a chairman? Do they do an honest job of it? Because that is when you can figure out, is the guy stepping on management's toes? Is there a turf issue here between the chair and the management? Those issues can come up in a board evaluation process.
I find most boards I'm on, it's ticking off a form where everybody says good, 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 you know. And very rarely
1 to 5 where everybody gets 6.
Yeah, everybody gets 5, and, you know, that's it. And you feel you've done your job, you've done the evaluation. But I have worked with a chairman who used to sort of, well, I was the CEO, he was the chairman, and he would call me to his office and we would actually talk about individual contributions. And I think that was a far more sensible way of evaluating the board than, you know, ticking off something on a form because it's required by law. So I have never really, you know, believed in this ticking off of forms. And I feel that a chat with individual directors, with the chairman, on performance is far more valuable.
But does the chairman get feedback from the directors?
He could if
On his own
he has to reach
performance?
out. He has to reach out to directors.
On his own performance?
On his own, nobody's going to sort of come to him. But I mean, like it was like on Saturdays, come over to my office and we'll have a chat.
Okay.
You know, that sort of thing. So that helps.
It, I think, depends. See, because I think the fourth schedule, right at the end, I don't know which part, it requires independent directors to evaluate the chairman.
That is the Satyam schedule you're talking about. Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
The conduct of independent directors, but this is a evaluation thing. And there are companies, and I know I have been in those where there is a proper discussion and the conclusions of that group of independent directors is conveyed to the chairman. And again, an amusing story. One of the conclusions that had to be conveyed to the chairman was, sir, you need to reduce your weight. We cannot have the chair of our company die of a heart attack. You're just in too crucial. So I know jocularly when this was conveyed, he said, oh, so your wife set you up to, my wife set you up to convey this to me because I hear it every day at home. So there are companies which do this honestly, but I also think that that's maybe 1 or 2%. The vast majority, as Homi said, tick the box, and I have been on those boards too, ticking the box.
No, if a chairman has an issue, it should be disclosed as a risk factor in a disclosure-based
Yes,
regime. Yes.
Indeed.
And then we'll see what happens to the share prices after that. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
No, my worry is really this, that you have a board as a collective. You have somebody who is leading that board. His or her job is to get the best out of the other persons in the boardroom.
Yes.
You know what they're good at, what they're not good at. Get them to contribute on matters relating to their area of knowledge or expertise or whatever. Now, to do that, the chair of the board needs to have several qualities, one of which is the ability to step back when the issue being discussed is one of operational detail and not one of strategy or superintendence or things of that kind. And does that require feedback from the independent directors? Does it require, because even chairpersons could do with mentoring sometimes. Does it require some kind of corrective mechanism? And I'm asking this because I did a program about 10 years ago in Chennai. And one gentleman who opted to attend that program, I'll take names, a very distinguished former finance professional called Mr. Vagul. Vagul had by then finished his active working life and he was reflecting on various other matters, but he chose to attend the program and then he said, look, I had this confusion earlier that I was chairman of the company. Now you're telling me I'm chairman of the board. And that the managing director runs the company and I should only run the board. And he says, I didn't know this earlier, I might have behaved differently. And it took courage for somebody to say that and say that in the open. But I'm seeing increasingly cases of evidence of people that are looking at minor operational details, especially if they have some kind of domain expertise, forget expertise, some familiarity with that particular operation, then you tend to start second guessing the management, and that's not a very helpful thing. That is why the question I have posed is, are they biting off more than they should be chewing? Maybe they can chew a lot, but should they be chewing that much? Yeah.
They shouldn't, because if they are biting off and chewing that, they are not getting the best of their colleagues on the board.
That's correct, yes.
Because they are assuming this is the right thing, and that kind of chairman doesn't brook much discussion on a topic then. He wants to move on to the next item on the agenda. Because I know what the right decision on this topic is, so I'll pay a little lip service, let a few people contribute a few things, and then I sum up. And my summing up is, my view is, not my view, he will convey that view as if it's the consensus of the board.
Yes.
And then move on to agenda number next. So this is not uncommonly a behavior of a strong personality.
It goes to the point that Homi raised earlier, who speaks first in the board? If the chairman leads the discussions and almost gives a kind of a direction to the rest of the board, this is what I would like the rest of you to state in support of what I'm stating, then you have an issue.
Correct.
One of the things which, gives a signal of the kind of chairman you have, or when there's a vacancy on the board, who should we take?
Yeah.
Most people want a very compliant, easygoing person who is not going to argue and create a nuisance value at the board. But, good governance really requires you to have some difficult people on the board. And there's a very nice thought which an old gentleman told me once, that good governance is like sleeping on a soft mattress. It hurts the next morning.
That's right.
So it's like that. There has to be some discomfort. And if you get people on a board who are prepared to challenge, prepared to argue a point, then you have a different kind of director. But if you choose everybody who sort of is going to nod his head and say yes, yes to everything, then you'll have that sort of board.
But you have the other kind of problem is the board has two types of directors. One is those who have something to say, and then those who have to say something. So you have to balance these two characters. The chairman got to get that balance right, get more airtime for those who have something to say.
Yeah, I think the board, the chairman has to really draw people out, because sometimes people are quiet. They don't want to speak, and they have to be drawn out because they do have a particular skill set or some knowledge which, is be valuable if they spoke, but sometimes they just don't speak. So it's the job of a chairman to really draw out people like that. And otherwise, some directors tend to dominate the board. Happens quite often. The dynamics of a board, you'll find 2 or 3 directors who want to sort of always come in first and dominate the discussion.
No, now the regulators are aiding that by saying that you got to attribute things, you got to put down names of who said what. Otherwise, inspectors will say you haven't participated in discussions. So then people want their names on that, and therefore will say something which might not be relevant to what is being discussed. Nawshir, in your experience, you've seen a lot of chairs, you've been a chair yourself. How do you look at the numbers? How many of them understand the role? They're not doing more than what they should be doing, but doing what they should be doing well enough, which is their role. And how many are doing a whole lot of things without adding value, roughly?
I can only speak from my very small span of observation. After all, there are thousands of companies, and I can't. So anything I say is based only on the very small group of companies I have observed. And I'd say that about half the chairmen are good chairpersons, let me say, because it's not fair to the women in the chairs. Chairpersons, about half are, I think, excellent chairpersons, and perhaps another quarter are perfectly acceptable, and there's about a quarter who could do much better. But I think the one area where chairs need to change a lot is that the world has moved on. We have moved on from shareholder value to stakeholder value, and that is completely missing on all boards. And I would love to see chairs bring the board's focus on that. In certain ways, Mr. Vikamsi said, why shouldn't directors receive stock options? They shouldn't, because independent directors represent all stakeholders, not only the shareholder. The minute their interest is aligned with the shareholder, they are blindsided to all the other stakeholders. So they should not, for that reason, but I have diverted or distracted us from the topic we are discussing. That is the one area where boards are totally lacking. Even on sustainability, let me say, there's a lot of lip service to sustainability. The reality in boards is there's no genuine discussion on how to make the business sustainable. And I'm sorry to say, most chairmen are also oblivious to that, unless you have an exceedingly enlightened chairperson who is very open to this. And I used to always agitate this. I had 2 chairpersons who described me as our activist independent director. Because I used to always bring up this topic after everything had been discussed. So I think that's an important aspect chairs have to focus upon, bring the focus on that.
Activism is fine. It's adventurism that's the problem.
Yes.
It is when activism becomes adventurism that is the real issue. Your experience of chairs.
Nawshir, you're talking about stakeholder acceptance as stakeholders, really the important component of a good governance model. But we had this in Tata's, we had the Tata Business Excellence model and the Baldrige model, where they brought in this concept quite early, many years ago in my time, and where I was a mentor. I used to be quite active in this Tata Business Excellence process. And there it was very clear that, the stakeholder is more important than anybody else in the business. And that was accepted by most Tata companies in the Baldrige system. So
Malcolm Baldrige model,
And that drove companies to excellence, doing things better. There was a competition between companies who'd get a higher score every year. We used to do assessments, and it's quite a motivating model.
That is true. Any last thoughts on this before we throw it open to the audience? I want to give them more time, this being the last session.
Sure.
Actually-
I think decisions can be made by chairman quite often, and some will be like biting off more than they can chew, but some will be, will come out successfully. I mean, I didn't want to mention, but I was working with Mr. Tata at the time. He did the Chorus acquisition and the JLR, Jaguar Land Rover, and one worked out very well, and Chorus, obviously, we bit off more than we chew. But, so every decision cannot be one way. There will be a balance. Some will go well, some will go badly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the chairman will always bite off more than he can chew. It's just.
No, there's some who don't bite. Public sector chairman, for example.
Yeah.
The biting is done in Delhi, actually.
Of course, some are so conservative they won't risk their name for anything. I don't want to be responsible for somebody saying that he took this decision. So.
Just because you said anything last you want to say, I have seen the other extreme. I was assessing the corporate governance in a very, very, very large company in India, one of the largest Indian companies, complex. And I met the chair of the audit committee, a highly respected finance professional, highly respected. And when I met him and we were discussing what his committee does and all, it was a matter of pride for him. He lived in New York. I travel, 14 hours, some number of hours. I arrive in the morning into Mumbai. I run the audit committee before lunch. After lunch, we have the board meeting, and I catch the flight back. Then it struck me, and I asked him that with that amount of involvement, what engagement did you actually have with the key members of the audit committee? Leave the board aside, the other members. You were the chair of the audit committee with your own colleagues. How much did you engage if this was your way of chairing your committee, that you arrive early morning, rush to the hotel, have a shower, shave, turn up at the meeting, run the meeting, and catch your flight back. So there are chairs. He was not the chair of the company's board, but he was the chair of the audit committee. So there are chairs who take the job very lightly, almost as if it's just a formality to be done, and we move on. So in some ways, I'm more concerned about those kinds of chairs than the chairs who engage more than they ought to. These fellows don't bite at all, never mind biting off more than they ought to. So that is also a matter of concern.
Yeah.
But
I was on the board of chair of an audit committee of a bank. And literally our audit committee was 1.5 days. Yeah. We literally started one afternoon, finished with the internal audit presentation, then the next morning had a long session with the external auditors, then looked at the results, and then next morning we'd present to the board. So literally I had to write off 1.5 days for that meeting.
And you would have had several meetings with the committee.
Quite a few
Because
meetings,
banks have a whole lot of
Oh
meetings.
yeah, my God. I was on the credit committee and the credit committee is even worse. It was every 3 or 4 days there'd be a meeting.
And I'm told now the Reserve Bank inspectors are asking to view the video recording of meetings.
Yes.
But it doesn't happen. I mean, I haven't, I've retired from that board, God knows how many years ago, but I still get, a notice sometimes for some case which has gone bad and have to come for a, meeting of that audit committee again and meet with the people and say, what did we actually do at that time? And, one of the things is the paperwork. How much paper can you store at the end of a meeting? I mean, if you have to sort of keep a store, I'd need a whole cupboard full for each board I'm on, Today, everything is soft copies, so it's fine. It's in your computer somewhere. You could probably dig it out, but there also you'll trash it after some time. But that's another issue for board members today. What do you keep? Is it worth keeping all the papers? You sort of
Actually, answer. I asked this question of 2 eminent lawyers. I'll name them, Zia Modi and Shradul Shroff.
Yeah.
Both have sat on company board. So I said, what do you do? They say, Nawshir, we keep every scrap of paper. Even if some page in the thing is replaced, we keep the replaced page also. All this is evidence to protect yourself. Because you never know when an action begins. The management and the owners of the business may well have changed. In fact, the action may be brought by the new owners against directors on the previous board. So they are not going to cooperate and supply you with evidence. So please keep everything. And they said, you're an auditor, you should know this. I said, yes, I know it, but I just wanted confirmation.
But we had a special carry bag for these huge files. We used to come, box files for each credit committee meeting. It ran into thousands of pages. Anyway, so.
Open for questions.
Yeah, sure.
Surya Narayana.
Good afternoon, sir. Now this insistence, regulatory insistence, that this chairman and managing director positions should be segregated. Is it right for the regulator to specify that? Or should it just be an aspect of good governance? The second question I have is, some companies have a executive chairman and there is a managing director who is separate. So if the chairman is supposed to only run the board, ensure that it functions well, what is the role of an executive chairman? That's it. Thank you.
What's your first question?
First
Separation.
segregation of chairman and managing
It
director.
hasn't happened because SEBI developed cold feet and did not enforce it. And now it's non-mandatory. Those who want to do it can do it. The real issue is if you combine both these functions in one person. I have described it in the past as the ultimate negation of corporate governance, because the chair heads the body called the board, which is to hold management accountable. The managing director is the head of management who's supposed to run the company. If both these functions reside in the same individual, you have a clear conflict of interest. And I think someday SEBI should summon the courage and say, yes, these two should be held by different persons. The problem was the second element in SEBI's prescription, which said they should not be related. Many promoter families were comfortable, not comfortable, but they would have lived with the separation. Father being chair, son being MD. But the minute you said you can't be, then that puts an end to the career aspirations of the son, right? So they will push back, and therefore the provision just disappeared. That's the first part. As for executive chairpersons, most public sector banks have, public sector organizations have had that for a long time. The real problem there is, it becomes a person-centric organization. Everything that that person does is what drives the organization. The rest are peripheral presences in the board, right? Has that been changed? Well, the RBI did that for private sector banks. In the case of public sector banks, there have been some persons who've been appointed chairpersons part-time, and then you have whole-time managing directors. But the earlier that is done, with clear understanding of who should do what, when the RBI did this, you had two kinds of chairpersons who were appointed, part-time chairpersons. One of them went and sat in the bank 4 days in the week, morning till evening. He said it was his job to see that the bank was run well, so he had a room, he had other facilities, he sat. The other, the model which appealed to me, was a former executive director of the Reserve Bank of India, who told the managing director, this is my phone number, this is my mail ID, this is my postal address. If you need me, I am available. Otherwise, I'll come and attend your meetings. I think that was closer to the truth of being a part-time chair. But this business of an executive chair, and just in a lighter vein, I made this comment in public. One of our famous companies, most people thought its middle name was Corporate Governance. One of our famous companies, I don't have to take names, south of the Vindhyas, an IT company, right? So when the founder came back to the board, he came back as an executive chairperson.
Yeah.
There was a managing director who was pushed up as executive vice chair of the board. And the question I asked was, if you have an executive chair and an executive vice chair, is the chief executive officer going to be non-executive? Because you can't have too many guys who are trying to, cook the dish. It doesn't work that way. Clear responsibilities, clear understanding of what they need.
Yeah, I think one of the things I liked about the Tata Group is we had a three-tier structure. Like Mr. Tata was totally non-executive. Then we had a vice chairman. And these vice chairmen were sort of across 2 or 3 companies. So the vice chairman got involved in operations and sat with the management team, but he wasn't taking decisions. He was facilitating. And then there was the executive, the managing director. So we had a 3-tier structure, and I think that worked very well, actually. So the vice chairman's role, like people like Gopal across 2, 3 companies.
Yeah, but I have nothing to really add.
Yeah, but I think that was a nice model as well. Yeah, I mean, combining the 2 positions is definitely a no-no.
I don't think
unless
that
it's a crisis situation, the guy comes back to sort things out. If the company's in a mess and he said, look, I've got to get back in the saddle and sort this out myself, that's probably one situation, but it's a short-term thing. Maybe for a year or 2, and that's it.
Then it gets to a situation of founders keepers.
Yeah,
that is the whole problem.
I
not
have come
finders
across these sort of
keepers.
situations where the guy gets back in the saddle only to clean up the mess of the past.
Perceived mess might not
Perceived
be a mess
mess,
also.
maybe, yeah.
Suddenly
Yeah.
might be missing
Yeah,
out
yeah.
on what
I mean,
he
some
was
of
doing
it
earlier.
is perceived, some of it could be really a
And then
problem.
come back.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Any other questions? I saw another hand going up somewhere in the middle. Yeah. Madhav, yeah.
In many organizations overseas, we are noticing that there is no managing director. It's only a CEO and a chairman. So what would be your view? Should the person who is heading the management be part of the board, or shouldn't he be part of the board?
You want to take that, Nawshir?
Yeah. Overseas, particularly in these investment banks and things, there are perhaps 100 managing directors. It's just a designation.
It's a level.
So, see, in our own country, if you go back to the 1956 Act, perhaps you have to go back to the 1857 Act. Managing director was the term always for the CEO. It was synonymous. The expression CEO didn't exist. Nobody had heard of such an expression. I hadn't heard of it for many years of my early part of my career. This all came in with an Americanization of our physiology. So the American title is CEO. Now, your question is, should the CEO be on the board? I have sat on company boards where the individual is described as managing director and CEO. It's a mouthful. All the minutes contain this, managing director and chief executive officer. So the thing is, they have a synonymous function. Your only question is, should the chief executive be a director or not be a director?
Yeah.
And that, according to me, I think the chief executive ought to be on the board, because then he is able to contribute at a level with his colleagues. If he is not a member of the board, he may well perceive himself as being inferior. And I don't know what the legal implications of that are, because the law also puts certain obligations on the managing director. Now, if you don't have a managing director, then I don't know, there are people here from the company secretarial side, they'll be better able to enlighten all of us. Does the liability then fall upon the entire board? Because there is no managing director, there is a chief executive, but he's not a director. So if there is something where an action must be brought against the managing director and there is none, because then there is a designation under the Companies Act, you have to identify a manager. At least this used to be in the old act. I don't know if the new act still requires, beg your pardon? KMP. Well, there is KMP, indeed. Yes. As you can see, I'm getting old. Yes, there is KMP. So can the chief executive be the KMP? He can. Well, so there you are. So then there is somebody who is
It's in the
identified.
Act itself.
He has to.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, yes.
I think.
No, but I have one question I would ask, which is related, but I'd like to ask Mr. Damodaran and Nawshir their views. What about the concept of a lead director? It's quite common abroad to have a person who's a lead director. Do you think it's a good idea?
I think it's a good idea if you have an executive chairperson.
Okay.
Because the non-executive element needs leadership.
Okay.
So this is the nodal person who interacts with the executive management. But if you have already an independent director as a non-executive chair of the board, then you don't need a lead independent director. In some sense, he performs that function.
Yeah.
I remember once I was discussing governance with Mr. Tata, and he said, look, in our country, our board meetings are 2 hours, 3 hours maximum. People come late, I have to leave early, I have another meeting. You know, he said, in the US, when I go and attend a board, it's a 2-day board.
Yes.
I spend 2 full days talking about, you know, so then you talk about strategy, you talk about operations, you talk about the future. It's a totally different concept. So I think
Our board meetings
are
are mostly,
very sort of
I
time
equate
bound.
them to meetings of the pathology department. So you look at the previous quarter, which is dead and gone.
Exactly.
You don't, like the preventive medicine department, look at what's going to happen in the next quarter if you do the following things. So we have this obsession with last quarter. So we're looking at what you can do nothing about. It's all written, finished. Any other questions? I think like an auctioneer at the IPL, I will have to say yes. Call the time and say done now. So if there's any last question, we can take that. No one wants to ask the last question, have the last word? No.
Perhaps on any topic, doesn't necessarily have to be on this biting of more. There is someone there.
Nobody wants to bite. There is somebody there. Good. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a very insightful discussion, the panel. One last question I would like to know, pardon my ignorance, is there a period or a limitation which the chairman should serve? I mean, should there be a stipulated regulation, just like how now we have come up for the auditors, that, the auditors can serve only for a limited period of time? Should there be such a stipulation or regulation for the chairperson as well?
Want to take that?
No.
Fixed terms.
I think the stipulation should be that when the chairperson is no longer effective, the board should convince the chairperson to step down. Because, putting absolute terms like you are independent for 10 years and 10 years plus 1 day you cease to be independent. I'm not a subscriber to that kind of philosophy. So I don't think there needs to be a particular time limit. What is important is that the board should be able to convey to the chairperson that you are no longer an effective chairperson, and that may be within 1 year of the person taking office. And you haven't, you're not a good chairperson, you should go. But now I'm, painting a picture in a world of perfection. Knowing realities, of course, that doesn't happen. But I'm not a big believer in rotation for the sake of rotation. I don't think that necessarily is.
The only place I'm coming from is there could be a perception, that there could be, less independence when it comes to the comfort area with the management, with
See, if the chairperson is an independent director, anyway, they have to go after 10 years. They can't continue. If they are the principal owners of the business, even if the rule prevailed, they would make sure the person who succeeds them would be amenable to being guided by this owner of, the majority shareholder, controlling shareholder. Shareholders are not owners of businesses, the controlling shareholder. So that is the reality in. After all, there is no limitation on how many years a fellow can be prime minister. He can go on and on and on till the good Lord summons him. So, putting a limitation necessarily, that's a much more critical role than the chair of a board. We don't have a limitation.
That's a very interesting parallel.
If that fellow can go on forever, why not the chairman of just 1/1,000,000th of the whole country?
Okay. No more questions, then all that remains is for me to, The auditor will sign off. Yes.
I'm taking the liberty, since Nawshir mentioned about any other topic, and I wanted to go back to the earlier topic of, is compliance good for business? That time, of course, a limitation on the time on questions. Of course, compliance is good for business. I think all entities should be compliant. but the plethora of laws, and I would say sometimes the unfairness of the law itself is, especially GST and all, and then the dimensions. I think it's the biggest moat which large companies have today. I would say they are able to comply better because of the resources which they have. And the entrepreneurial spirit which we want to live for the country to make it, I think the biggest challenge in my view is the number of compliances which we have. Yes. And though all of us intend to do better, and of course SEBI, Anant was there, and hats off to SEBI, the way the whole consultative process is there. I think no other regulator has that type of a consultative process. But the way the regulations are being implemented in some of the regulators or the laws are getting enacted, just to give one case in GST, if you have paid a vendor for the GST amount and he doesn't pay to the government, I think the company has to pay the amount along with interest and penalty. And there's only one small example. There are a number of such examples. So, and the big daddies can of course afford that unless you pay the GST, I'm not going to pay you. The large companies, the smaller ones can't. So I think this needs some focus. The way the regulatory, I fully appreciate it is coming out of various scams, etc., what the regulators are seeing, but we're going to the other side of the pendulum. So some balance somewhere, moderate path, from the regulatory mindset perspective, I think is required. Because in my view, that is the biggest handicap of unleashing the entrepreneurial spirit in the regulatory compliance itself. Though I'm fully, say compliance should be there, but just the number of thousands and thousands of compliance which are there, it's just impossible for smaller entities to comply everything properly.
No, what we heard this morning from the whole-time member is that they are very actively working on how to make life a little easier by looking at what regulations exist, etc. Long way to go. I'm only hoping that those that you heard yesterday in the first session and the gentlemen you heard today, that they will walk their talk. If they do, life will be good. If they don't, and when they travel the long distance from here to SEBI, if the mind changes, then you have an issue. Because they said a lot of good things yesterday. I mean, it was like music to the ears of people that are doing business on how they were bending over backwards to accommodate legitimate problems. But that's not something that one has seen evidence of, and you keep hoping that's the only thing.
Yeah, because we've heard of this kind of thing many times. And we're still waiting for reality. Yes.
No,
what
GST,
worries
of
me
course,
is that compliance is actually taking away valuable time from other things which could be done.
This was
at the board level.
what the session was yesterday, but nobody was, subscribing to that. The problem is, there is a question of where you sit influences of you. If you're a panelist, then you have a view. But when you go and sit in the audience, you're not convinced with what you yourself said when you're sitting on the panel. As for GST, let me share a small anecdote with you. I was speaking to a bunch of students about 2-3 years after GST was implemented. And one of the students asked me, and I was not talking about GST, it was something else, but I think he had this problem in his head. And he asked me, so what do you think about GST? Is it a good tax? I put a counter question to him. I've been a great follower of the Morarji Desai style of responding to questions. You ask a question when somebody asks you a question, right? So I asked him, so what does your father do? And he said, my father is a businessman, and I knew where it was coming from. Yeah. So I said, people describe this as a good, simple tax. Is it good? You should ask the government. Is it simple? You should ask your father. Between them, they will tell you what GST is about. I have nothing to add on this subject. If there are no questions, we will close. Thank you very much to both of you. And thank you, audience.
All our panelists. Thank you, Mr. Khusrokhan, Mr. Mirza, and Mr. Damodaran for that wonderful session. May now request Mr. Damodaran to please present a memento to each panelist. So on behalf of each panelist, Excellence Enablers is proud to have sponsored education for one girl child for 1 full year through the NGO Nanni Kali, a Mahindra initiative.